Good evening and welcome to the Gospel Truth. I'm Alan Jackson, bringing to you spiritual songs and hymns and the power of the spoken word of God. First of all, giving thanks to God Almighty for blessing me with this another opportunity to yet be on this time side of life and to have this another blessed privilege to come to you in His name by way of this television medium and to bring to you another message from His holy and divine word. And as I always do, I like to continue to express my appreciation and my gratitude to the production staff for their continued service to the gospel truth. And it is my prayer that God will continue to bless each one of them with those things that He knows that they are standing in need of as well. And then, of course, I'm praying on your behalf as participant observers. And it is my prayer that God will continue to bless you and your family with all of those things that He knows that you're standing in need of as well. And then, of course, I'm encouraging you to pray on my behalf because I'm also standing in need of prayer, and it's only God who can provide me with those things that I am standing in need of. Well, I certainly want to continue to welcome you to the Gospel Truth February 2023 tribute to Black American history. So this evening, this is a crash course on Brown versus the Board of Education, a great landmark decision.
Hi, I'm Clint Smith, and this is Crash Course Black American History. And today, we're going back to the courtroom. If you've been watching this series, it's probably starting to feel like a pretty familiar place, because a lot of history has played out here. While many Black Americans were being kept from voting because of domestic terrorism and Jim Crow laws, the courtroom became a place where unfair practices could be challenged. Today, we're going to talk about one of the most important cases in U.S. history, the Supreme Court case, Brown v. Board of Education. Let's start the show. Because Black people often didn't have representation in their state or congressional bodies, it sometimes made changing laws through legislation difficult. But the courts were one avenue through which Black Americans were able to fight for their citizenship rights and feel like they had a chance. When the Constitution was amended to include the Reconstruction Amendments, aka the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, Black Americans were formally made citizens of the United States. And citizenship is important because it affirms that you have access to rights and resources in your country. But many white Americans weren't okay with Black Americans becoming citizens. They benefited from Black Americans not having the same protections and resources that they did. And so white Americans created Jim Crow laws that implemented segregation and hindered Black Americans' right to vote. We'll talk more about the civil rights movement and the fight to vote in a few more episodes. But segregation is an important place to start. Segregation wasn't just morally bad, but also discreetly, or maybe not so discreetly, assured that Black Americans wouldn't be able to access all of the practical and material benefits of their citizenship. And this sets the stage for Brown v. Board of Education. Access to public school education was definitely one of those citizenship rights that Black Americans were entitled to. But white Americans used Jim Crow laws and the Plessy v. Ferguson decision, which stated that separate but equal schools made segregation okay, to justify keeping the races separate. But the reality was that separate was rarely equal. Many schools for Black students were severely underfunded, had outdated materials, and were just generally dilapidated. Schools for white students, on the other hand, often had drastically better resources. The injustice was clear, and Black Americans started organizing to get their Black students the education and resources that they deserved. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People had their eyes on the issue of school segregation way back in the 1930s, when they commissioned the Margold Report. The report ran over 200 pages, and half of them dealt directly with segregation in schools. During that time, the NAACP had some small victories for equal education in public colleges and universities, but when it came to elementary and secondary schools, segregationists just wouldn't budge. But Brown v. Board of Education happened in the 1950s. So why are we talking about the 1930s? Well, things in the courts can take a long time, and the NAACP was playing the long game. The execution of their plan took about 20 years, starting with the leadership of Charles Hamilton Houston, a Harvard graduate and the director of the NAACP's legal strategy, and ending with the legal prowess of his mentee, Thurgood Marshall. In 1952, the NAACP brought 5 different cases on school segregation from different states: South Carolina, Virginia, Kansas, Delaware, and the District of Columbia. The NAACP's lawyers presented legal arguments on how unconstitutional segregation and separate but equal were. These 5 cases were combined into Brown v. Board of Education and went to the Supreme Court in 1953. Let's go to the thought bubble. Oliver Brown was an assistant pastor who lived in an integrated neighborhood in Topeka, Kansas. In September of 1950, Oliver Brown went to his local elementary school, the Sumner School, and tried to enroll his daughter, Linda. The principal said that she would not be allowed to attend because she was black, and the school did not accept black students. The principal also said that state laws allowed for segregation. So basically, sorry, not sorry. Since Linda couldn't go to her local school, which was only a few blocks away from her home, she had to attend the all-black school, but it involved a 2-hour commute via bus and car. This led to a very sleepy Linda Brown and a very upset Oliver Brown. Different historians will tell you different things about what happened next. Some say that Brown went to the NAACP and became part of the lawsuit. Others say that the entire act of going to the local school in the first place was at the NAACP's urging. Either way, while there were eventually 12 other plaintiffs as part of the NAACP's case, Oliver Brown, on behalf of his daughter, became its lead plaintiff. And even though we associate the Brown name with desegregation, Linda Brown was never actually able to attend the Sumner School, because by the time the ruling was handed down, she was in junior high. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Thurgood Marshall was the chief attorney for the plaintiffs. Marshall was a victim of, but also a victor over, segregated education himself. After graduating with honors from Lincoln University, he was unable to attend the University of Maryland Law School because he wasn't white. Undeterred, he attended Howard University School of Law instead, which had become the first black law school in the nation in 1869. He graduated first in his class. He later went on to become the head of the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, and ultimately, he would be appointed by Lyndon B. Johnson as the first black American Supreme Court justice. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Back to Marshall's NAACP days. Marshall and his team argued before the Supreme Court that segregated schools were unconstitutional and that separate but equal had to go. And the court finally agreed with them. And on May 17, 1954, the Supreme Court unanimously held that segregated public schools violated the Equal Protection Clause. In his decision, Chief Justice Earl Warren said, quote, "We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Therefore, we hold that the plaintiffs and others similarly situated for whom the actions have been brought are, by reason of the segregation complained of, deprived of the equal protection of the laws guaranteed by the 14th Amendment." This was a huge victory for Black Americans, but enforcing the ruling was a different story. After Brown v. Board overturned separate but equal in schools, riots and violence erupted all over the country. White protesters terrorized Black communities throughout the South, especially in South Carolina, Georgia, and Mississippi. In Texas and Florida, white vigilante groups burned crosses to terrorize Black residents. Some scholars have argued that even though a budding civil rights movement propelled Brown v. Board to victory, the backlash against the case accelerated the civil rights movement as Black Americans were increasingly harassed and abused by angry segregationists. Some school districts even decided to close all of their schools rather than allowing Black children to integrate them. For example, in 1959, the Prince Edward County School System of Virginia completely shut down, so that white students didn't have to go to school with black students. Many white parents sent their children to segregated private schools, and black children either had to go to school in another county, which was just unfeasible for so many families, or not go to school at all. And it wasn't until 1964, in another unanimous Supreme Court case, Griffin v. County School Board of Prince Edward County, that the Prince Edward County schools reopened. Some black children missed out on 5 years of their education. 5 years. So while it would be easy to look at Brown v. Board as an example of America changing for the better, and the Supreme Court doing what's right simply because it was right, it's also important to look at the broader context that animated that decision. At this time, tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union were at their peak, and the Cold War was an omnipresent force in both American and global politics. Many top officials in the U.S. government, including justices on the Supreme Court, were acutely cognizant of how segregation and images of violence and terror enacted against black people harmed the United States' reputation and their ability to say that American democracy was the greatest in the world. Chief Justice Earl Warren said in a 1954 speech to the American Bar Association that our American system, like all others, is on trial both at home and abroad. The extent to which we maintain the spirit of our Constitution, with its Bill of Rights, will in the long run do more to make it both secure and the object of adulation than the number of hydrogen bombs we stockpile. So while it was about black children's right to an education, it also was about much more than that. Just think about it. Jim Crow was so deeply entrenched in American society that people would rather shut down an entire school system for years rather than allow black children to attend. Essentially, Jim Crow and separate but equal policies were used to diminish the quality of the black American citizenship experience. We all know that a quality education can improve economic outcomes. So when so many black Americans were prevented from having access to the resources they needed for a quality education, it perpetuated the community's economic despair. What's more, Brown v. Board also had some pretty drastic unintended consequences. As the ruling was being implemented across the country, tens of thousands of black teachers and principals lost their jobs. Black children were now beginning to attend white schools, but those white schools didn't want black teachers. The idea of a black teacher or principal being in a position of authority over white students was just a non-starter for many white parents. Another unsettling part about this is that while Brown v. Board attempted to get rid of segregation in American schools because of policy decisions around education, housing, and zoning, the sad truth is that schools today are as segregated as they were in the late 1960s. Clearly, there's still a lot of work to do. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Crash Course is made with the help of all these nice people, and our animation team is Thought Cafe. Crash Course is possible with the help of all the people who bought the 2021 Crash Course Learner Coin and by all our patrons on Patreon. Thank you to all our patrons and supporters for making Crash Course possible.
I got my COVID-19 vaccination, and here's why. This isn't about gimmicks or sentiment or what commercial I like. This is about facts. COVID-19 vaccines are safe and effective. Millions of doses have already been given in the United States, and these vaccines have the most intensive safety monitoring in U.S. history. People from different races, ages, genders, and ethnicities participated in large clinical trials around the world to make sure this vaccine worked for all kinds of people. The amount of time and effort dedicated to developing these vaccines was huge. Scientists used existing research and technology so they could get the vaccines developed quickly and safely without skipping any steps. If you need any more information, use a reliable source like the CDC website to get the facts.
The Gospel Truth does have a prayer list, and we invite you to write to us and to send to us the names of your friends, your relatives, and your loved ones. We will add their names to the prayer list. I'll pray for them, encourage you to pray for them, and everyone in the viewing audience to pray for them as well. And you can also send those names to The Gospel Truth at P.O. Box 3944, Berkeley, California, 94703. Or if you have a Bible question, you can leave that Bible question on the answering machine and we will answer that for you on the air. You can do that at 510-848-8843. And this is a crash course on Emmett Till.
Hi, I'm Clint Smith, and this is Crash Course Black American History. The 1955 murder of Emmett Till, a 14-year-old boy visiting his family in Money, Mississippi, was one of the most important catalysts of the civil rights movement. A heads up that this episode is going to include some violent descriptions and images, but we think it's important to do so that you can more fully understand what prompted so many Black Americans to mobilize and risk their lives in the pursuit of civil rights. These descriptions of violence also demonstrate how the threat of being subjected to domestic white supremacist terror hung over Black people in the South like a cloud that just wouldn't go away. Let's learn more about what happened to Emmett Till and start the show. In August of 1955, Emmett, who lived in Chicago, was visiting his uncle and cousins in Money, Mississippi. Emmett and a group of teenagers went shopping at a local store called Bryant's Grocery and Meat Market. The store, owned by Roy and Carolyn Bryant, sold items to mostly Black sharecroppers and their families. Some kids who were outside of the store later stated that they heard Emmett whistle at Carolyn. Later, Carolyn Bryant accused Emmett of making a sexual remark toward her and of grabbing her. And as we'll get to soon, this was a lie. A few days later, in the middle of the night, on August 28th, Roy Bryant, Carolyn's husband, and his half-brother, J.W. Millam, kidnapped Emmett from the home of his uncle, Mose Wright. Emmett's cousins witnessed the kidnapping. Emmett Till was then brutally beaten by Roy Bryant and several other members of the white community. He was taken to the edge of the Tallahatchie River, shot in the head, tied to a 75-pound metal fan that weighed his body down, and then dropped to the bottom of the water. 3 days later, his body was pulled from the water. He was so badly beaten and decomposed that his family could only identify him by the ring on his finger. Following the murder, Emmett Till's body was shipped back to his family in Chicago. His mother, Mamie Till, while emotionally distraught, made a decision that would reverberate throughout history. She decided that her son should have an open casket funeral. As she put it, "Let the people see what they did to my boy." Emmett's body was on display for 5 days at Robert's Temple Church of God. Tens of thousands of people came to pay their respects and to see in person the evidence of the violence inflicted on this child. But what made the name Emmett Till iconic was a powerful and devastating photograph that was taken by David Jackson, which captured Mamie Till gazing down at her son's ravaged and deformed body. The image is haunting, and what these men had done to Emmett's face was horrifying. The photo, along with others, were published in Jet magazine, and the images of Till's deformed face, alongside images of him before his death, smiling and looking like the child that he was, forced people to confront the terror that Black people in the South had been subjected to for a century. Mamie Till would say, quote, "I believe that the whole United States is mourning with me, and if the death of my son can mean something to the other unfortunate people all over the world, then for him to have died a hero would mean more to me than for him just to have died." This seems like an important moment to acknowledge why Black-led media outlets, like Jet magazine and the Chicago Defender, both of which were based out of Chicago, are so important to telling and understanding the story of Black life in this country. These outlets told the sorts of stories that other outlets weren't always willing to. And during the civil rights movement, they would play an enormous role in sharing the news about marches and covering the violence that protesters experienced. Today, the original Jet magazine, with published photos of Emmett Till, can now be found in the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. But back to the murder itself. So in early September, the governor of Mississippi, Hugh White, ordered officials to prosecute Roy Bryant and J.W. Millam in the case. Now, let's pause here. In previous episodes, we've learned about important legal victories for Black Americans at the federal level. But the state and local courts were often a different story. To put it mildly, this court case was a sham. But unfortunately, it was not atypical. Rarely were lynchings and brutal murders like this actually prosecuted with real justice. And people knew that. White people knew that throughout the South, they could kill a Black person and get away with it, which is how so many thousands of Black people came to be lynched in the century following the Civil War. And this terror was intentional. As Sherilyn Ifill writes in her book, On the Courthouse Lawn, Confronting the Legacy of Lynching in the 21st Century, quote, more than the poll tax, the grandfather clause, and Jim Crow segregation, lynching and the threat of lynching helped regulate and restrict all aspects of Black advancement, independence, and citizenship. On September 19, 1955, J.W. Millam and Roy Bryant were tried in Sumner, Mississippi. An all-white jury was selected, and no Black jurors were even considered. In the trial, plenty of testimony and evidence showed that Millam and Bryant did kill Emmett Till. Even Emmett's uncle testified that he saw him kidnapped and pointed out who did it. But it didn't matter, and Emmett's uncle was even run out of town for telling the truth. The jury deliberated, and after 1 hour and 7 minutes, they ruled that Millam and Bryant weren't guilty. The Black community in Mississippi and across the country was devastated by this outcome. But they weren't surprised. And if the not guilty verdict wasn't enough on its own, in January 1956, Bryant and Millam admitted to committing the murder. Like, they just said it, directly, with no equivocation. They did this because they were protected by double jeopardy, the idea that one cannot be tried for the same crime twice. And since they were already found not guilty in a previous trial, they could not be prosecuted by the legal system. All of this happened after Brown v. Board of Education, which has led many scholars to say that this event was an example of the hostility that many white people in the South had toward that ruling and toward the emerging civil rights movement. After the trial, many other publications around the world picked up the story as well. These articles explicitly addressed the hypocrisy of American ideas of justice, independence, and freedom. Part of what I think about when I think about the murder of Emmett Till is how recent this history is. A few years ago, I was walking through the National Museum of African American History and Culture with my grandparents, and in the museum is an exhibit that holds the casket that Emmett Till was originally buried in. I was pushing my grandfather, a man born in 1930 Jim Crow, Mississippi, in a wheelchair as we entered the room. We approached Emmett's casket, its bronze hue radiating under the museum lights. It sat open, exposing us to a photograph of what Emmett's mother, who, remember, insisted on an open casket funeral, had chosen to show. What white supremacy had done to her son. I had seen the images of it before, and did not need to listen to anything other than the soft buzzing light above us to know of Mamie Till's unceasing sobs. My grandfather looked at the casket, his eyes moving unhurriedly across its frame, and said, "He was killed in the next town over from where your grandmother and I lived, only a few miles away." As you know, I think about the history of racism in this country all the time. I think about how quickly we are to espouse notions of progress without accounting for its uncertain and serpentine path. I think of how decades of racial violence shape everything we see. But sometimes I can forget its impact on those right next to me. I sometimes forget that but for the arbitrary nature of circumstance, what happened to Emmett Till could have happened to my grandfather. Emmett Till was born in 1941. If he were alive today, as of the recording of this video, he would be 80 years old. This is important to understand that he could have very easily still been alive today, going to the grocery store, picking up his mail from the post office, waving hello to his neighbors, or going to his grandchildren's soccer games. The possibilities of growing old were stolen from him, as they have been stolen from the thousands of Black people lynched across the 20th century. Sometimes we tell ourselves that the most nefarious displays of racial violence happened a long time ago, when they were in fact not so long ago at all. These images and videos that appall our 21st century sensibilities are filled with people who are still among us today. I think often of Ruth Bonner, the woman who rang the bell to signal the opening of the National Museum of African American History and Culture in 2016, and how she was the daughter of a man born into slavery. Not the granddaughter, not the great-granddaughter. She was the daughter of someone born into slavery. None of this was that long ago. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Crash Course is made with the help of all these nice people, and our animation team is Thought Cafe. Crash Course is possible with the help of all the people who bought the 2021 Crash Course Learner Coin, and by all our patrons on Patreon. Thank you to all our patrons and supporters for making Crash Course possible.
I'm Alan Jackson, and I'm inviting you to join us again next week, if it's God's will, when the gospel truth will once again come your way, bringing to you spiritual songs and hymns and the power of the spoken word of God. Until then, it is my prayer that God will continue to bless you and your family and to keep you all safe.